Checkers explains corruption.
Hello everyone, I'm Checkers Nixon, and this series is about political corruption. I'm being voiced by Professor Chara Torres-Spelliscy. You can follow her work on Twitter @ProfChara. The real Checkers Nixon died in 1964, but this is her origin story. In 1952, the presidential race was going very well for Eisenhower, who was best known by his childhood nickname Ike.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike.
But late in the campaign, newspaper stories with allegations against Ike's vice presidential candidate, Richard Milhouse Nixon, surfaced. The allegation was that as a U.S. Senator, he had benefited from a secret political fund. The fund raised the specter of quid pro quo corruption. The amount at issue in the Nixon fund was approximately $18,000. But remember, that's back in 1952. Today, that $18,000 would be worth closer to $150,000. The question raised was whether Senator Nixon was personally benefiting from the money, since when the fund was created and spent, Nixon did not have an ongoing election. To defend himself from these charges of corruption, Nixon went on television on September 23, 1952, to address the nation. The whole speech really should be thought of as a paid infomercial for a vice presidential candidate.
How can we believe what you say? After all, is there a possibility that maybe you got some sums in cash? Is there a possibility that you may have feathered your own nest? And so now what I am going to do, and incidentally, this is unprecedented in the history of American politics. I am going at this time to give to this television and radio audience a complete financial history.
The speech has been called a financial striptease because it included Nixon talking about his personal finances.
We lived rather modestly. For 4 years, we lived in an apartment in Park Fairfax in Alexandria, Virginia. The rent was $80 a month. And we saved for the time that we could buy a house. Now, that was what we took in. What did we do with this money? What do we have today to show for it? This will surprise you, because it is so little, I suppose, as standards generally go of people in public life. First of all, we've got a house in Washington, which cost $41,000, and in which we owe $20,000. We have a house in Whittier, California, which cost $13,000, and on which we owe $3,000. My folks are living there at the present time. I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything.
And in the speech, he talks about getting an audit from Price Waterhouse and a legal opinion from Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher saying that he had done nothing wrong. These references could lead a viewer with the misimpression that the law firm and auditor looked at all of Nixon's finances. They did not.
To read to you the opinion that was prepared by Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher and based on all the pertinent laws and statutes, together with the audit report prepared by the certified public accountants. Quote, "It is our conclusion that Senator Nixon did not obtain any financial gain from the collection and disbursement of the fund by Dana Smith, that Senator Nixon did not violate any federal or state law by reason of the operation of the fund, and that neither the portion of the fund paid by Dana Smith directly to third persons nor the portion paid to Senator Nixon to reimburse him for designated office expenses constituted income to the senator which was either reportable or taxable as income under applicable tax laws. Signed, Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, by Elmo H. Conley. Now that, my friends, is not Nixon speaking, but that's an independent audit which was requested because I want the American people to know all the facts. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
By referencing Checkers, his 6-year-old's dog, he leaves the misimpression that someone is about to sweep in and take the dog. But at the time, there were no limits on gifts to U.S. senators, so no one would have had the authority to steal Nixon's dog from his 6-year-old.
I'm Torres-Spelliscy. One of the things that I deal with in my new book, Political Brands, is the use of television advertising to influence voters, which really took off in the 1952 election. One of the instances of a paid political ad was the Checkers speech. So while the fund at issue in the Checkers speech was only $18,000, the RNC spent far more than that, $75,000 to be exact, to air the speech to the public.
The following program is sponsored by the Republican National Committee, the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, and the Republican Congressional Committee.
Another thing that's easy to miss when you look at it is that the speech was done on a soundstage at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood. And so the desk that you see is a set desk. The chair that Pat Nixon is sitting on is part of that set. And so this whole setup was just a bit of political theater. And after the Checkers speech was aired, Adlai Stevenson, who was running against Ike and Richard Nixon, released 10 years of his own taxes and challenged Richard Nixon to do the same. But Nixon would not release his own taxes. Thus, all of the claims about his personal finances in the Checkers speech remain unverified.
Nixon goes on to win the vice presidency in 1952 and in 1956. In 1968 and 1972, he wins the presidency. Now, there were lots of campaign finance problems in the 1972 election. That will be a topic for a future Checkers Explains Corruption. One final note, one of the reactions to the Checkers speech, ironically, was 25,000 individuals gave money to the RNC. So the response to a scandal about a political fund was ironically the generation of even more campaign contributions. Thanks for stopping by. This is Checkers Explains Corruption. This is Checkers Nixon signing off.